A neighborhood store with absolutely no connection to professional soccer can receive a letter from international lawyers just for putting the phrase World Cup in a barbecue promotion. An entire stadium carrying a major company's name for 20 years has to erase that name during exactly the weeks when more people on the planet are watching it than at any other time. And a sovereign nation, with its own constitution and its own parliament, passes special custom-built laws to protect the commercial interests of a private organization headquartered in Switzerland. None of this is exaggeration. It is simply how FIFA protects the name World Cup. In the previous video on this channel, you saw how FIFA turns popular passion into billion-dollar profit, hidden behind the label of non-profit. Now we are going to open the second half of that same story, and in many ways, it is even more surprising. Because the control FIFA exercises is not limited to the money that flows directly into its accounts through broadcasting, sponsorship, and ticket sales. It extends to something far more subtle and far harder to challenge: the right to decide who can and who cannot use certain words, certain names, certain images, anywhere in the world during the tournament period. Think carefully about the size of that. There are organizations that control money. There are organizations that control territory. But controlling language itself, controlling the very right to mention an event in a commercial context, is a much rarer kind of power, and a much harder one to spot because it never shows up as a line item on a financial statement. It shows up as silence. The silence of small business owners who would rather not risk it. The silence of companies that avoid any mention of the tournament for fear of a legal notice. The silence of stadiums that, for a few weeks, pretend not to have the name they have always had. Throughout this video, you are going to understand exactly how this second empire was built, how a simple combination of words became valuable intellectual property, how temporary laws are created specifically to protect this kind of monopoly, how entire commercial zones around every stadium start operating under different rules from the rest of the city, and how a nearly perpetual licensing system turns this legal protection into recurring revenue year after year with no need for reinvention. And if you watched the previous video, you already know exactly where this is heading, to the same place as always. Because just like in the financial machine we already explained, this brand monopoly also has a single guaranteed winner in practically any scenario imaginable. For now, let's start with the most basic point of all: how exactly an ordinary word turns into exclusive property valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. There are words that cost money to use. We are not talking about slang accidentally trademarked or obscure product names. We are talking about a phrase that every child in the world knows by heart: World Cup. And the detail very few people know is that this phrase, along with the name FIFA and dozens of variations around it, is registered as a trademark in practically every commercially relevant country in the world, and protected with a level of legal aggressiveness we normally associate with massive entertainment franchises, not a sports tournament. Think about the scale of that for a moment. A combination of two common words, world and cup, on their own mean nothing special. But put together and tied to a specific event, they became an intellectual property asset valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, just in licensing and commercial protection terms alone. It is not the ball that is worth so much. It is not the stadium. It is not even the gold trophy handed to the champion. It is the exact combination of letters, symbols, and phrases that FIFA managed to turn into exclusive property. This kind of monopoly over language did not come from nowhere, and it is not exclusive to FIFA either. Major film franchises, American sports leagues, and even music festivals do something similar, registering names, logos, mascots, and even catchphrases as trademarks. What makes FIFA's case particularly interesting is the scale. Very few events on the planet draw such a gigantic audience with so many people willing to spend money just to associate themselves, even informally, with that cultural moment. And here is the point we are going to explore throughout this entire video. The same organization we saw in the previous video profit billions from broadcasting, sponsorship, and ticket sales, built in parallel a second empire, perhaps even more sophisticated, based entirely on controlling language, image, and commercial association. This empire does not appear in headlines about net profit. It appears quietly in contracts, lawsuits, and legal requirements that shape the behavior of companies, cities, and even small business owners around every edition of the tournament. And there is a clear strategic reason for this kind of empire to exist alongside the financial one. Brand and money protect each other. The more valuable the World Cup brand becomes, the more expensive the official sponsorship rights become, because sponsors are, in practice, buying exclusive access to that very same combination of words and symbols we just saw being protected so aggressively. If any company could freely associate itself with the tournament without paying anything, the value of official sponsorship would collapse overnight. In other words, the brand monopoly is not a separate chapter from the financial machine. It is, in fact, the legal foundation that supports the value of everything we covered in the previous video. If you had not thought about this before, get ready. From now on, you're going to start noticing in practically any advertisement, event, or product related to the World Cup the invisible weight of this brand control. It is worth remembering before we move on that this kind of protection is not exclusive to sporting events, but it rarely reaches this level of sophistication in other industries. Pharmaceutical companies protect drug names, automakers protect car model names, but few achieve the kind of sweeping control that FIFA exercises over practically any combination of words, symbols, and even colors associated with the tournament. It is a level of protection we normally only see with the intellectual property of extremely valuable fictional characters, the kind owned by major film and animation studios, not in sporting competitions organized by national federations. And to understand how this works in practice, we need to start with a very concrete and somewhat bizarre example. Entire stadiums that, during the tournament, simply stop existing, at least in name. Imagine a stadium that has carried the name of a bank, an airline, or a telecom company for decades. That name is everywhere. On tickets, on outdoor signage, on regular TV broadcasts, on the GPS of anyone driving there. Now imagine that for a few weeks, that name simply disappears, replaced by a generic version with no commercial branding attached at all. This is not hypothetical. It is exactly what happens, edition after edition, with the stadiums that host World Cup matches. As part of the hosting contracts we analyzed in the previous video, every stadium has to temporarily remove any reference to sponsors who are not official FIFA partners, including, in many cases, the stadium's own name, if that name belongs to a brand competing with one of the tournament's official sponsors. Think about what that actually means in practice. A company that spent years and a fortune paying for the right to have its name stamped on a stadium has to, by contract, accept that very same name disappearing temporarily during the most watched sporting event on the planet, exactly the moment when the most people would be seeing that brand. It is like renting a giant billboard on a busy avenue and, on the single busiest traffic day of the year, being forced to cover the billboard with a white sheet. This kind of requirement exists because FIFA sells category exclusivity to its official sponsors, and any other visible brand inside the event's perimeter, even if it is simply the stadium's own name, is treated as a threat to that exclusivity. It does not matter if the stadium's brand never had any direct relationship with soccer, nor whether its presence there is purely structural, the result of a naming rights deal completely unrelated to the tournament. During the event period, FIFA's rules override the local commercial rules that had already existed for years. And the strangest detail is that this is usually not even discussed publicly as a problem, because the companies that own these stadiums already know well in advance that this kind of clause is practically standard in any contract to host matches. They agree to temporarily give up their own branding in their own stadium in exchange for the prestige and long-term visibility of simply being known as the stadium that hosted the World Cup. This is just one easy-to-understand, visual example of a much broader phenomenon. FIFA's ability to temporarily redesign the commercial rules of entire cities and companies, purely through the force of the tournament's own name. And there is a financial dimension to this trade that is rarely discussed openly. The company holding a stadium's naming rights typically paid, over the course of a 10 or 20-year contract, sums adding up to hundreds of millions of dollars, expecting exactly this kind of long-term media return, visibility, and brand association. Agreeing to erase that name during precisely the period of highest possible audience means, in practice, giving up a peak return on an investment already made, with no direct compensation from FIFA. The logic that sustains this acceptance is almost always the same. The future prestige of having hosted the World Cup supposedly makes up for that one-time loss, even though no one can actually prove that with hard numbers. And to understand just how far this power reaches, we need to look at an even stranger legal tool, laws created specifically to protect a private event, even when those laws did not exist before, and vanish as soon as the tournament ends. Here is a fact that seems, at first glance, almost impossible. Several countries that hosted recent World Cups had to pass temporary laws, created specifically to protect FIFA's commercial interests, laws that did not exist before the countries bid, and that, in many cases, stop applying as soon as the tournament ends. This kind of legislation is often informally called an anti-ambush marketing law, and it exists to combat a specific practice. Companies that did not pay to be official sponsors, but that tried to associate themselves with the event indirectly, through advertising campaigns, promotions, or simply by exploiting physical proximity to the stadiums and the host city during the tournament period. And here is the detail that tends to surprise people most. For a country to even be considered a candidate to host a World Cup, it generally has to formally guarantee to FIFA in advance that it will pass this kind of special legislation before the tournament begins. In other words, it is not a spontaneous, sovereign decision by each government. It is, in practice, a contractual condition to even enter the bidding process, similar to the tax exemption requirement we saw in the previous video, except this time applied to brand and advertising control instead of taxes. Think about the legal strangeness of that for a moment. A sovereign nation, with its own parliament, its own constitution, and decades of legal precedent on intellectual property and fair competition, passes a custom-built temporary law to protect the commercial interests of a private organization headquartered in Switzerland. It is not an exaggeration to say that very few private entities in the world get this kind of direct influence over the legislation of multiple sovereign countries, repeatedly every 4 years. These laws usually go far beyond what traditional trademark legislation would already allow. They can prohibit, for example, a non-sponsoring company from distributing freebies near stadiums, organizing parallel events that mention the tournament, or even using generic phrases associated with the World Cup mood in advertising campaigns, without ever mentioning FIFA directly, but clearly trying to capture some of the public's attention during that period. This kind of expanded protection exists because traditional trademark legislation in practically every country was designed to prevent confusion between competing brands, not to prevent any indirect mention of an event whatsoever. If FIFA depended only on normal intellectual property laws, it would have much less power to stop this kind of indirect association. That is why the strategy of demanding special, custom-built legislation, even before choosing the host, became a central piece of the legal engineering behind the tournament's brand monopoly. It is also worth noting how this kind of special legislation usually gets passed fairly quickly and with little political resistance, precisely because it is wrapped inside the national excitement of hosting such a major event. Few lawmakers want to be publicly seen as the politician who almost stopped the World Cup from happening in our country over some technical detail about brand protection. This kind of informal political pressure, combined with the short approval windows imposed by the tournament's own calendar, creates nearly ideal conditions for this kind of legislation to pass with minimal public debate, even when it temporarily overrides well-established principles of fair competition. And it is exactly this kind of special law that gives power to one of the most visible and most controversial tools in this entire system. Entire zones around stadiums where only certain brands are allowed to appear, even on property that does not belong to FIFA at all. If you have ever visited or watched closely on TV the area immediately surrounding a stadium during a World Cup, you may have noticed something strange, an almost total absence of advertising that is not from official tournament sponsors, even in stores, restaurants, and public spaces that have absolutely no contractual relationship with FIFA at all. These areas have a technical name in sports marketing jargon: clean zones or restricted perimeters. Within a specific radius around each stadium defined by contract between FIFA and the host city, practically no commercial advertising is allowed to appear, except from the tournament's official sponsors. This includes signs, banners, the uniforms of locally contracted cleaning or security crews, and even, in some cases, store window displays that would normally show off their own brands. Think about how heavy that is for a small local business owner. A clothing store that has existed for 20 years on a corner near the stadium selling its own products, with its own brand in the window, can be forced temporarily to remove or cover that visual identity simply because it falls inside the area defined as a clean zone. FIFA does not own that property. It is the city that took on, by contract, the obligation to guarantee this kind of restriction as part of the full package of requirements to host the tournament. And here is a comparison that helps explain the commercial logic behind this. Imagine you pay a fortune to be the only advertiser inside an American football stadium. You would not be happy if, just outside, on the street leading up to the entrance, there were dozens of other brands competing for the attention of the very same audience you paid dearly to reach exclusively. Clean zones exist precisely to eliminate this kind of attention leakage, guaranteeing that, from the parking lot to the seat in the stands, the fan's visual experience is dominated only by the brands that paid for the right to be there. The problem, of course, is that this kind of requirement shifts a very real cost onto local merchants who never signed any contract with FIFA, never received a single cent of sponsorship money, and still have to adapt or temporarily hide their own commercial identity simply because they happen to be geographically close to where the big money is flowing. This kind of situation raises an uncomfortable question, worth carrying with you for the rest of this video. To what extent is it fair for a private event, organized by an entity headquartered in another country, to have the power to temporarily redesign the commercial rules of entire neighborhoods in a city that does not even own the tournament, but is merely hosting it? There is also an extra layer of complexity in these restricted zones worth mentioning. They do not only apply on match days. In many editions, the restricted commercial perimeter goes into effect weeks before the first match and remains active for a period after the tournament ends, significantly widening the window during which local merchants have to operate under these special rules. For a small business that lives on monthly cash flow, extra weeks of commercial restriction on top of the tournament period itself can represent a meaningful chunk of lost or compromised annual revenue. And it is exactly this kind of tension that brings us to the central question of the next topic. Who exactly has the right to use the phrase World Cup in any commercial context? It is also worth noting that these restricted zones are rarely communicated clearly to the general public. Local merchants usually find out the exact details of the perimeter and the specific rules they need to follow through fairly technical municipal notices. often just days before the restrictions actually take effect. This lack of clear advance communication on its own already creates an extra disadvantage for those with fewer resources to keep up with this kind of bureaucracy, reinforcing once again that the real weight of these rules falls unevenly on those with the least capacity to adapt quickly. Here is a question that seems absurd to even ask, but that has a fairly concrete legal answer. Can you use the phrase World Cup in your own business name, in a promotion, or in an advertising campaign? The short answer is, it depends entirely on how you use it and in what context. And it is precisely in that gray zone where much of the legal dispute around FIFA's brand monopoly actually plays out. There is a legal principle present in trademark law in many countries known as nominative fair use. In simple terms, it allows anyone, a person or a company, to mention a registered trademark, even without authorization, as long as that mention is necessary to identify what is being discussed, is made in a minimal way, with no exaggerated visual or textual emphasis, and does not imply in any way that there is an official sponsorship or partnership with the trademark holder. To make that concrete, a newspaper can publish an article mentioning the 2026 World Cup without committing any violation, because it is simply reporting on a real event without pretending to be an official partner of it. Likewise, a bar can advertise that it will broadcast the World Cup matches on its screens, because it is describing a fact, the public showing of matches that are happening anyway, on free TV or streaming services. But there is a line that clearly separates this kind of legitimate use from a real violation, and FIFA monitors that line extremely aggressively. If a bar creates a promotion called World Cup of Beer, selling special combos during the tournament, it is already getting dangerously close to suggesting a direct commercial association with the event, even without using any official logo. If a clothing store launches a World Cup collection, selling T-shirts with the tournament's colors and themes without any official license, it is, in practice, creating commercial products derived from a registered trademark without authorization, which is a much more serious violation than simply mentioning the event in a news story or conversation. And here is what makes this boundary so tricky. The difference between commenting on and associating with often comes down to subtle details of language, visual design, and perceived commercial intent, exactly the kind of nuance that tends to turn into a legal dispute and which explains why so many small and medium-sized companies, without a robust legal department, simply avoid any mention of the tournament during that period, afraid of crossing a line that is not always easy to identify clearly. This widespread fear, worth noting, is on its own a form of power. You do not need to sue everyone who crosses the line in order to control the behavior of an entire market. It is enough that the fear of being sued is already strong enough to make most companies back off before they even try. This phenomenon has a direct parallel in any area of life where one party holds vastly superior legal resources than the other. Insurance companies that know most customers will never legally challenge a denied claim. Banks that know most account holders will never go to court over an improperly charged fee. In every one of these cases, the true limit is not defined by the exact letter of the law, but by the actual willingness of the weaker party to risk time and money in a dispute against someone with nearly unlimited resources. And understanding that dynamic is, on its own, one of the most valuable financial lessons you can take from this video into any area of your own life. And it is exactly this widespread defensive behavior that we are going to explore in more depth now, through real cases involving small business owners who, intentionally or not, ended up on the wrong side of that line. Every major brand protection structure needs, at some point, to show it is willing to take action, and it is not uncommon for the most visible examples to involve not rival corporate giants, but small local merchants, bar owners, clothing store owners, and service providers who never had any intention of competing with FIFA only of modestly riding the wave of excitement generated by the tournament. The pattern repeats itself in practically every recent World Cup edition across different countries. Small businesses create promotions, decorate storefronts, or name products with direct references to the tournament, with no intention whatsoever of pretending to be an official sponsor, just trying to capture a bit of the popular excitement already in the air. In a large share of these cases, these small business owners receive formal notices, letters from lawyers, or demands to immediately remove any material that mentions the tournament in a commercial way. Think about the power imbalance in this kind of situation. On one side, an international organization with specialized legal departments, a practically unlimited budget to monitor the use of its brand globally, and teams dedicated exclusively to tracking down this kind of unauthorized use. On the other side, a bar owner or a small clothing manufacturer with no lawyer of their own, no deep knowledge of intellectual property law, and no real ability to legally challenge a formal notice coming from an organization of that size. In practice, the overwhelming majority of these small business owners simply cave at the first notice, removing the material, changing the promotion's name, or discarding products already manufactured, even in cases where legally the use might well have been within the limits of nominative fair use that we described in the previous topic. Not because the law was necessarily on FIFA's side in each of these specific cases, but because fighting legally against an organization of that size costs time and money that most small businesses simply do not have available. This phenomenon has a name in commercial law: the chilling effect. The mere existence of a track record of aggressive brand protection actions is already enough to preemptively discourage any use, even legitimate use, by anyone who lacks the resources to test the legal limits in practice. The result is a market control that goes far beyond what the law, strictly read, actually guarantees, simply because no small player is willing to risk a prolonged legal dispute against an opponent of that scale. And this same pattern of asymmetric power, which we just saw at the scale of small merchants, repeats itself in an even more expensive and structural way when we look at entire cities, which have to negotiate and concede under similar conditions, just with several extra decimal places added to the amount of money involved. It is worth noting, before we move on, that this kind of asymmetry does not mean every notice sent by FIFA is automatically baseless or abusive. There are cases where companies genuinely try to deliberately and aggressively take advantage of the tournament's visibility, creating products nearly identical to the official ones, selling them at lower prices, and causing real confusion among consumers. The central question is not whether FIFA has the right to protect its brand. It genuinely does. And that protection exists in any intellectual property system in the world. The question is the size of the margin this notification power creates, even in cases where the use was, in practice, perfectly legitimate. And there is still an important difference between how this power is exercised against a small business and how it is exercised against a competitor closer to FIFA's own size. When two large organizations dispute the use of a trademark, there is usually a real legal process with evidence, hearings, and a judge ruling based on the law. When the target is a small business owner, the process almost never gets that far because the initial notice is already enough to end the matter. This difference in treatment in practice is not written into any law, but is the direct and predictable result of the economic power gap between the parties involved. In the previous video, we saw the direct financial costs American cities are paying to host the 2026 World Cup: tax exemptions, infrastructure, security. But there is a second layer of cost, less talked about, and directly tied to the brand monopoly we are exploring now: the formal commitment taken on by every host city to actively protect FIFA's commercial interests within its own municipal territory. In practice, this means that the city's own legal department, or local police force in some agreements, becomes partly responsible for enforcing and curbing the kind of unauthorized commercial use we discussed in the previous topics: clean zones, ambush marketing, misuse of protected phrases. The city is not just giving up physical space and tax revenue, it is, to some extent, outsourcing part of its own regulatory and enforcement capacity in favor of the commercial interests of a foreign private organization. It is worth comparing this requirement to any other kind of commercial event a city might host. When a city hosts a major music concert or a corporate convention, it is not normally required that City Hall take on an active role of commercial enforcement on behalf of the event's producer, in coordination with local police, for weeks at a time. The scale of this specific requirement, applied to FIFA's brand monopoly, reveals just how much the tournament is treated as a category of its own, with a level of contractual protection that few other kinds of commercial events can demand from a municipal government. And there is an ironic detail in this equation. The host cities themselves, which give up a large share of their regulatory autonomy during the tournament period, usually justify this agreement by citing the long-term legacy the World Cup would supposedly leave behind: future tourism, international visibility, enhanced value of the city's own brand. As we saw in the previous video, the actual track record shows that most recent host countries and cities recorded a direct financial loss from the event, which makes this brand legacy a far harder promise to quantify than the very real, very concrete costs taken on in the contract. This kind of trade, giving up regulatory autonomy and tax revenue today in the name of a vague promise of future prestige, is a pattern that shows up repeatedly in negotiations between governments and large private entities across many industries, not just sports. And perhaps the most important financial lesson from this topic is exactly this. Whenever someone asks you to give up direct measurable control today in exchange for a future benefit that is hard to quantify, it is worth asking who exactly is carrying the real risk of that trade. And speaking of value that is hard to quantify, there is a side of this story that few fans directly associate with FIFA, but that is deeply connected to the same brand control system, the billion-dollar and growing universe of licensing products and brands related to professional soccer. It is also worth noting that this kind of trade, uncertain future prestige instead of guaranteed revenue today, does not happen only between cities and FIFA. Local private businesses, hotels, restaurant chains, travel agencies frequently invest in advance in extra capacity, renovations, and temporary hiring, anticipating a demand surge during the tournament, which in some cases materializes strongly and in others falls well short of expectations, precisely because much of the tourist spending related to the World Cup concentrates heavily inside the zones controlled directly by FIFA, leaving less than people imagine to circulate freely through the rest of the local economy. Here's a question that seems distant from this video's theme, but that is more connected than it appears. Why can some soccer clubs, or even the World Cup winning national team itself, sell jerseys, licensed products, and image rights for amounts that rival major international luxury brands? The answer has a lot to do with the same principle that sustains FIFA's brand monopoly: controlled scarcity of visual identity tied to global prestige. An official national team jersey with the correct crest, licensed by the official manufacturer, is worth dramatically more than an unlicensed replica with the exact same visual design, even when the actual physical quality difference between the two is minimal. What you are really paying for in most of that price is not the fabric, it is the right to use that symbol in an officially recognized way. FIFA, along with national federations and the clubs themselves, built over decades an extremely profitable licensing system based exactly on this principle. Companies pay fortunes for exclusive licensing contracts to manufacture official products, jerseys, balls, video games, sticker albums, and in exchange, they earn the right to use crests, logos, and even the image of specific players under strict usage rules defined by contract. And here is a perfect example of how this same model expanded recently: the relaunch of the club tournament in an expanded format, bringing together the most valuable clubs on the planet in an entirely new competition, created largely precisely to open yet another revenue front for sponsorship, broadcasting, and licensing. Applying the exact same formula we already saw working so well in the traditional World Cup, take a product that already exists, club soccer, and repackage it inside a new brand structure with new exclusive sponsorship contracts and new broadcasting rights sold from scratch. This reveals something important about the financial engineering we are deconstructing across these two videos. It does not depend on creating new products. It depends on packaging, repackaging, and licensing products that already exist under increasingly protected and exclusive brands, multiplying the commercial value of the same basic content through tight control over who can and who cannot officially associate themselves with it. And this licensing model, once established, has a particularly interesting feature from a financial point of view. It practically has no expiration date. Unlike a sponsorship contract that needs to be renegotiated every tournament, image rights and brand licensing can generate revenue continuously, year after year, through entirely new products sold under the same old, well-established brand umbrella. Think about how many licensed products you have seen over your lifetime, sold with the crest of a national team or a major club: cleats, school backpacks, bedding, mugs, even special edition credit cards launched in partnership with banks during World Cup periods. Each one of these products represents a separate licensing contract, negotiated individually, generating a fraction of royalties that, added to thousands of similar contracts around the world, builds an enormous, distributed, and nearly invisible revenue stream for anyone who only watches the game from the outside, without ever paying attention to this entire parallel second market. And it is exactly this kind of perpetual revenue that we are going to explore in the next topic. It is also worth noting an interesting observation about the end consumer of this licensing market. A large share of the people who buy this kind of product know perfectly well that they are paying a price far above the real manufacturing cost, and they still make the purchase consciously, even proudly. This happens because what is being sold is not, strictly speaking, a physical product. It is a symbol of belonging, of identity, of emotional connection to something bigger than the person themselves. This kind of consumption dynamic, where perceived value comes almost entirely from symbolic meaning rather than practical utility, is exactly what makes traditional luxury brands so profitable. And it is also exactly what makes sports licensing a business so structurally similar to the luxury market, despite selling products at a much more accessible final price for the average consumer. Here is perhaps the most elegant and most underappreciated aspect of this entire brand monopoly system. Once a phrase, a logo, or a design is registered and protected, the trademark holder can keep collecting royalties on it indefinitely without ever needing to create anything new each cycle. Think about how many product categories we have already seen throughout this video sold under official license related to the World Cup. Balls, jerseys, video games, sticker albums, caps, toys, board games, mobile apps, and the list keeps growing with every edition as new product categories and new digital platforms emerge. Each of these categories represents a new source of royalties charged on a brand that already exists for more than 100 years and does not need to be reinvented, only relicensed again and again to each new interested manufacturer. This business model has a well-known name in the corporate world: scalable passive income. And it is exactly the type of model that sophisticated investors look for in any industry, an asset that, once created and protected, keeps generating revenue with practically no additional marginal cost, simply by licensing the right to use it to whoever is willing to pay. The difference between FIFA and an ordinary brand licensing company, however, is that FIFA managed to build this system around something that technically belongs to global popular culture, soccer itself, and to the collective language built around it. Nobody owns the concept of a competition between national teams, of cheering for a team, or of celebrating a goal. But FIFA managed to wrap all of that inside a specific layer of intellectual property: names, logos, phrases, visual formats, enough to charge royalties on practically any commercial product that wants to officially associate itself with that collective feeling. It is worth drawing a parallel here with personal investing, the difference between an asset that generates active income, where you need to keep working continuously to keep getting paid, and an asset that generates passive income, where the initial work of building it is followed by decades of recurring revenue with minimal effort, is exactly the difference between most traditional jobs and the kind of wealth that actually builds long-term riches. In that sense, is not just a sports organization, it is, from a pure financial engineering standpoint, one of the largest collections of intellectual property-based passive income assets in the entire entertainment world. And perhaps that is exactly why this structure is so hard to dismantle or even to regulate more strictly. It does not depend on any specific sporting result, on any scandal being resolved, on any change in leadership. It depends simply on the continuity of popular passion for soccer, something that, historically, has never shown any sign of fading. This is, in fact, the type of asset any investor would dream of having in their own portfolio, a revenue stream that does not depend on any specific management decision, on any brilliant marketing campaign, on any revolutionary new product launched every year. It depends only on something already deeply rooted in human culture for more than a century, and that, year after year, keeps renewing itself through a new generation of fans being born, growing up, and repeating exactly the same pattern of emotional consumption that sustained the previous generation. And it is exactly this permanence that brings us to this video's final reflection on what truly sustains an empire capable of surviving any result, any scandal, and any change in leadership. If you watched the previous video on this channel about FIFA's financial structure and made it this far, you now have the complete picture of how this empire works and why it is so hard to challenge. On one side, there is the direct financial machine, broadcasting, sponsorship, ticket sales, all structured within a favorable tax framework that allows the organization to officially operate as non-profit while projecting billion-dollar profits. On the other side, there is the layer we explored in this video, an almost absolute control over the language, image, and visual identity associated with the tournament, protected by custom-built special laws, restricted commercial zones, and a licensing system that generates practically perpetual revenue, year after year, decade after decade. And the most striking part is how these two layers reinforce each other. The money generated by the brand monopoly funds part of the legal capacity to protect that very same brand even more aggressively, which in turn sustains the value of the sponsorship and broadcasting contracts, which in turn fund even more of the legal protection structure. It is a self-feeding cycle, and precisely because of that, it becomes harder to challenge as time passes, not easier. Think about any other power structure, financial or institutional, that you have ever studied or experienced in your own life. The longer a system like this operates without being effectively challenged, the more entrenched it becomes, the more resources it accumulates to defend itself, and the more expensive and more risky it becomes for anyone trying to challenge it from outside. That holds true for commercial monopolies, for political structures, and as we have seen throughout these two videos, it holds perfectly true for the empire built around the most watched sport on the planet. And here is perhaps the most valuable final lesson from this entire journey. There is a huge difference between admiring a well-built system from a purely strategic and financial standpoint and naively accepting that this system is fair, inevitable, or immune to any kind of questioning. FIFA built over more than a century perhaps one of the most sophisticated financial and legal engineering structures ever seen in the entertainment world. On its own, deserves to be studied and understood seriously. But understanding how a system works is completely different from accepting it without any criticism. The next time you watch a World Cup, cheering for your team, celebrating every goal, you might start noticing in the smaller details this double empire working in the background. In the stadiums that temporarily lost their own names, in the restricted commercial zones around every arena, in the licensed products sold at luxury prices, and in the near total absence of any small local business daring to mention the tournament without authorization. And if you put together everything we have seen across these two videos, the financial machine that profits billions under the label of non-profit, and the brand monopoly capable of temporarily redesigning the commercial rules of entire cities, it becomes clear that we are looking at something far more sophisticated than a simple sports tournament. We are looking at one of the best designed value capture systems in the modern world, built piece by piece over more than 100 years on the most solid foundation any business could ever wish for, a human passion that never cools down. And once you notice all of this, you will understand exactly why, regardless of which national team lifts the trophy and regardless of which scandal eventually surfaces behind the scenes, there is always the same guaranteed winner across every layer of this story, financial and brand alike: FIFA itself. So let's bring the two halves of this story together. In the previous video, we saw how FIFA built a financial machine capable of generating $10 billion in profit from a single tournament hidden under the legal label of non-profit. In this video, we saw the second layer of that same empire, the almost absolute control over the language, image, and visual identity surrounding the event, sustained by custom-built laws, restricted commercial zones, aggressive notices against small business owners, and a licensing system that turns a simple combination of words into perpetual revenue year after year. And here is the question I want to leave you with before we close this chapter. How many times in your own life or in your own business have you agreed to use or avoided using certain words, certain images, certain formats, simply because it's safer that way, without ever checking whether that restriction actually had solid legal grounds or whether it was just well-trained fear? Because it is exactly this kind of fear, multiplied across millions of small individual decisions around the world, that sustains much of the power behind any brand monopoly, not just FIFA's. This lesson goes far beyond sports tournaments and licensing contracts. Think about how many times you have avoided negotiating a price, disputing a charge, or questioning a contract clause simply because the other party seemed too big or too organized for the fight to be worth it. Learning to tell a real limit, apart from a merely assumed limit, created by your own fear of questioning it, is one of the most valuable skills you can develop inside and outside the business world. And that is exactly the kind of thinking we want to train with you here, video after video. And perhaps the biggest contrast between these two videos is exactly this. In the first one, we talked about billions of dollars flowing through visible contracts, numbers that any auditor could, in theory, track on a spreadsheet. In this second video, we talked about a much quieter kind of power, measured not in dollars hitting a bank account, but in how many times someone, somewhere around the world, decided not to do something, not to mention something, not to risk something, just because the risk seemed too big. This kind of power does not show up in any annual financial report, but maybe that is exactly why it is the hardest kind of power to measure, to question, and to challenge. I am not saying FIFA does not have the right to protect its own brand. It does, like any organization that builds something valuable over more than 100 years. What is worth questioning is the size of the margin that this protective power ends up creating and how far it reaches into spaces that originally belonged to collective language, to popular culture, to the simple act of celebrating a goal at the corner bar. And if there is one thing these two videos together make clear, it is that truly understanding money is never just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about understanding structure, power, and the subtle difference between rules that exist to protect something legitimate and rules that exist simply because no one so far has had enough resources to question them. And since we have made it this far together through these two entire parts of this story, what impressed you more across these two videos? The billion-dollar profit disguised as non-profit, or the almost absolute control over words, names, and images that most people never even realized existed? Leave it in the comments because I genuinely want to read your answer, and I want to know if, after these two videos, you're going to watch the next World Cup with different eyes. If you enjoyed understanding how financial empires get built behind facades that seem simple, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because that is exactly this space's mission. Showing what truly sustains the power, the money, and the institutions that shape the world around you, one story at a time.